I've hurt myself and others by not knowing these things. It's borderline criminal to not teach this stuff at school. Show a teenager this one video and their entire life could be different. That's the top comment on this podcast by Stanford neuroscience professor Dr. Andrew Huberman, and today I'm going to be summarizing the entire 2-hour podcast into information that you can use in your everyday life. Dopamine, the most misunderstood yet influential chemical in your life. This single strand of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen can determine whether you succeed with what you want in life or whether you fail. Without it, you'll be in a perpetual state of lethargy, and gaining more of it is more complicated than you think. So how does it work? Well, first, let's talk about some misconceptions. Dopamine hits are not real. We work off these things called baselines. Basically, there's dopamine always circulating through you at all times, the level of which determines your mood, motivation, concentration, etc. This is a dopamine concentration graph. According to Huberman, this is the most important piece of information to understand out of the entire podcast.
But if you remember nothing else from this episode, please remember this, that when you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. Okay, so these peaks in dopamine, they influence how much dopamine will generally be circulating afterward. And you might think, oh, a big peak in dopamine, after that, I'm going to feel even better because I just had this great event. Not the case. What actually happens is that your baseline level of dopamine drops.
The straight line here is called a dopamine baseline, which we previously explained. What is important though are these peaks and troughs. You see, this is the foundation of everything. If you know how these work and how to manipulate them, you can control a multitude of seemingly external influences in your life.
Dopamine has everything to do with how you feel right now. It has everything to do with how you will feel an hour from now. It has everything to do with your level of motivation and your level of desire and your willingness to push through effort. If ever you've interacted with somebody who just doesn't seem to have any drive, they've given up, or if you've interacted with somebody who seems to have endless drive and energy, what you are looking at there in those two circumstances is without question a difference in the level of dopamine circulating in their system. There will be other factors too, but the level of dopamine is the primary determinant of how motivated we are, how excited we are, how outward-facing we are, and how willing we are to lean into life and pursue things.
So let's start with peaks. The dopamine levels go way up above baseline, usually as a result of something pleasurable or rewarding, and then they go back down after the enjoyable experience. But pay close attention. You see, the baseline previous to the peak was actually higher than the baseline after the peak. So after a peak in dopamine, our baseline of dopamine will actually decrease. This isn't for nothing. Long story short, this function is to motivate humans to search for food and survival. If we stay permanently gratified after meals, we're not influenced to try and find more. But that's not important. What is important is how that affects modern humans. Here's an example. Let's say you smoke nicotine. Although that nicotine will feel gratifying, your actual dopamine baseline after smoking will be lower since the nicotine made your dopamine peak. Well, I'm talking about peaks a whole lot. What about troughs? They're the exact inverse to peaks. Notice how after the negative experience and drop of dopamine, it returns to a baseline higher than the previous one. That is the inverse effect compared to peaks. And I'll give another example here. You have to take out the trash every day, and you dread it. Your dopamine baseline will actually increase after you do that non-enjoyable activity. You can deliberately do this by doing cold exposure like ice baths, but we'll get to that later. Back to dopamine itself. Dopamine is called a neuromodulator, and don't get overwhelmed and click off the video just yet. It's a lot more simple than it seems. Dopamine being a neuromodulator basically means that it influences communication of many neurons, not just one. This is why dopamine is so influential. It affects a multitude of cells rather than just one. Hence the effects on motivation, drive, confidence, mindset, energy, feelings, and even time perception. Dopamine can be delivered one of two ways: synaptically or volumetrically. Again, these are just big words with realistically simple definitions. Synaptic release is what we call narrow release. This means that dopamine can be released to satisfy a specific part of your brain. For example, the part of your brain controlling hunger gets satisfied or neuromodulated when you eat because individual neurons or brain cells are delivered dopamine as a result of satisfying that hunger. This is in contrast to volumetric or broad release, which is when dopamine is kind of dumped all over, indiscriminately reaching receptors. This is important since dopamine increasing medications, basically these medications increase both broad and narrow release. This means that they raise your baseline and peaks of dopamine equally, which outlines another function of dopamine, Extent. The extent to which you enjoy something is entirely reliant on the difference of dopamine baseline to the peak of dopamine. For example, if your peak is really high, but your baseline is also really high, then your enjoyment will be relatively low. You see, it's the difference between the peak and the baseline. If that peak is far away from the baseline, very enjoyable experience. If the peak is very close to the baseline, not very enjoyable experience. For example, if your peak is really high, but your baseline is also really high, your enjoyment will be relatively low. If your baseline is really low and your peak is really high, then the enjoyment will be relatively high. Extent also plays a role in the way how dopamine baselines increase or decrease. In that first example, with the relatively low enjoyment, dopamine baseline would decrease a relatively low amount. This is because the peak is relatively not much bigger than the baseline, so the decrease is not going to be that big. In the second example, with the relatively high enjoyment, dopamine baseline would decrease by a high amount. Since the difference between the dopamine baseline and the dopamine peak are much larger. Think about the graph. Imagine the peaks being high up on the y-axis, but still small, since the baseline is also high up on the y-axis as well. So it'd be more like that, rather than all the way down here, peaking all the way up to here and then going down. Because of this, dopamine medication, like the ones that I previously mentioned, will help motivation and whatnot, but only in the short term. Neurons can communicate quickly. Dopamine, meanwhile, doesn't go quick. Dopamine's effects are not always immediately evident. Huberman describes dopamine's effects as either slow, extremely slow, or extremely long-lasting. This is why ice baths have become so popular. While transient or short-lasting things like nicotine lead to peaks, ice baths are longer-lasting. For hours afterwards, dopamine baseline itself will increase rather than peak. This is because the ice bath itself is a major trough, which, if you remember, increases baseline to the same extent the trough forces dopamine below baseline. You see, Huberman describes dopamine as a pool. The analogy basically says that when you get an increase in dopamine, a spike, it takes dopamine from that pool, which is why the following baseline is lower. There's less dopamine in that pool to spend on the baseline. If you stop using dopamine by doing something negative, like an ice bath, then you're saving that dopamine, which gets added to the pool and then gets spent on baselines, hence the higher baseline. I think it's a beautiful way to visualize it, and I think it really helps with understanding dopamine if you don't have graphs or visual aids handy. At this point, there seems to be an imbalance of more qualitative than quantitative examples and data. So here's some quantitative aspects of dopamine. Excitability is directly determined by dopamine. Adrenaline, or epinephrine, the general excitation chemical, is actually derived from dopamine. L-dopa, or levodopa, turns into dopamine, which then turns into noradrenaline or norepinephrine, same thing. And then if that doesn't get used, then that turns into adrenaline or epinephrine. So those who are not excitable are actually likely suffering from a low baseline of dopamine. Speaking of baselines, here's some approximate and subjective numbers. Chocolate increases dopamine 50% above baseline. Pursuit and achievement of sex increases dopamine 100% above baseline. Smoked nicotine increases dopamine 150% above baseline, and cocaine increases dopamine 150% above baseline as well. Amphetamine increases dopamine 1000% above baseline. Enjoyment of exercise is up to 200% above baseline, but again, these numbers are subjective. They're all reliant on the enjoyment of the activity. So if I don't like exercise, I might actually see a decrease in dopamine when doing it. Now that you understand baseline dopamine functions, you can understand why things like amphetamine are so destructive. The new dopamine baseline after that peak is forced so far downwards that nothing in the world would be the same, and nothing would warrant the same enjoyment as it once did. This is the same thing that happens with other substances like nicotine or cocaine, just on a lesser scale. This is something that I personally think is very overlooked when it comes to addiction. People love to talk about the physiological downsides to addiction, like coughing or physical abnormalities, but I think the psychology of it is equally important. Even if a substance like nicotine had no physiological downsides to it, which it does, this is just a hypothetical, it would still be extremely beneficial to your drive, motivation, and mindset to quit because of the baseline dopamine functions that we described earlier. It still peaks your dopamine and lowers your baseline regardless. Anyways, enough of a personal tangent. Let's get back to what Huberman was saying. Listen to what Huberman says here.
Right. So for instance, the pen that I'm holding right now is one of these Pilot V5s. I love these Pilot V5s. They don't sponsor the podcast, but I just happen to like them. I like the way that they write, how they feel. If I spent enough time thinking about it or talking about it, I could probably get a dopamine increase just talking about this Pilot V5. And that's not because I have the propensity to release dopamine easily. It's that as we start to engage with something more and more, and what we say about it and what we encourage ourselves to think about it has a profound impact on its rewarding or non-rewarding properties. Now, it's not simply the case that you can lie to yourself and you can tell yourself, I love something, and when you don't really love it, and it will increase dopamine. But what's been found over and over again is that if people journal about something, or they practice some form of appreciation for something, or they think of some aspect of something that they enjoy, the amount of dopamine that behavior will evoke tends to go up.
I've actually talked about something similar to this in a previous video. Basically, we can convince ourselves on how rewarding or non-rewarding something is, and this can have an extreme effect on dopamine response to that thing. I'm using the very undescriptive word thing since this can apply to almost anything. An activity, a reward, a punishment, an emotion, anything with positive or negative valence can be reconstructed. Editor's note here, I just want to say that valence is just something's goodness or badness in psychology, since I never defined it. You can't really tell yourself something that you don't believe. You have to be optimistic and see the good sides of something. You have to see the glass half full. A personal example of this is hunger. I've been bulking for a little while, and I've gained a lot of unwanted weight, so now I'm cutting. And by cutting, I mean cutting calorie intake, cutting weight gained. When hunger comes around, it sucks. However, I can restructure this negative thought into a positive one when I look at the positives of it. The feeling of hunger, in of itself, is what I need. Me feeling hunger means I'm in the process of accomplishing my goals, and I'm just that much closer to the finish line. This is called cognitive restructuring, and it can have a positive effect on dopamine levels. It can help me stay motivated to accomplish this goal, but there are some more nuances to it though. You cannot dislike some aspects and reinforce that dislike while reinforcing your enjoyment of other aspects. An example of this would be me reinforcing my dislike of fasting by saying that the hunger I experience sucks, while the weight loss I experience is great. This will actually decrease baseline dopamine levels. If you feel that you have the means and resources to accomplish your goals, then your dopamine levels will increase. But if you feel that accomplishing your goals requires stress or resources that you don't have, like time, then your dopamine levels will actually decrease. Me looking for that dopamine spike of seeing progress while constantly being fed that dopamine inhibition of hunger would leave me much less motivated to continue with that goal, especially since the spike of seeing progress would lower my baseline dopamine levels even further. Long story short, optimism will always win. Stay optimistic and you'll stay more motivated for the long run. If you let pessimism take over, the inverse will happen. I like to say that life is what you make it, and this is a perfect example of that. If you tell yourself that it isn't going to work out and that you dislike these things, then eventually you will start disliking those things and it will not work out. You have to be your own coach, not your own hater. This is similar to the thought that if you have higher expectations of yourself, then you'll be much more likely to reach those lofty expectations compared to someone who wants to be more pessimistic and self-degrading. Your bar is what you set it at, and your enjoyment/perspective of life is what you make it. I wanted to add this quick segment about caffeine since it's applicable to lots and lots of people, including me. Caffeine does result in a very small increase in dopamine, but that's not its major effect. Regular ingestion of caffeine increases density and population of dopamine receptors. This means that the benefits associated with dopamine, like drive and motivation, can be felt more sensitively and can be acquired a lot easier. But it's also a double-edged sword. You see, the feelings applied to dopamine decreases as well. Since there's more receptors, you'll be a lot more sensitive to drops in dopamine as well, not just increases. The biggest mistake with dopamine and the main cause of addiction is redoing a dopamine-raising activity to try and increase happiness. Generally, when doing something the first time around, the enjoyment will be objectively higher, but then the second or third or fourth time around, it will start to get stale and boring. Redoing a dopamine spiking activity like this puts you in a sort of death spiral, since the spikes are going to get lower and lower relative to the baseline because your enjoyment is going to go lower and lower relative to the baseline, and the baseline itself is going to get lower and lower as well because of the constant dopamine spiking. The way to prevent this is to do everything in moderation. Don't try and redo something to get the same spike from it. Try and make sure you maintain a healthy baseline. The previously mentioned death spiral is how the casino gets you to keep playing. It's how the drug dealer gets you to keep buying. If they feed you that spike over and over and over, it lowers your baseline, making you reliant on that same spike in order to make your dopamine levels feel like they're at a normal level again, and that's only momentarily. Another common mistake of dopamine is this work hard, play hard mindset. This mindset usually fails and results in burnout over the span of multiple years. When dopamine gets spiked over and over and over, these subtle drops in baseline happen. They might not even be perceivable, but in the long run, they can lower that baseline so low that you won't feel inspired or motivated to do much at all. It's burnout. But what do you do if you're burnt out? Let's say that you found out now that you're at a low dopamine baseline. How do you increase it? Well, do not engage in what Huberman calls dopaminergic activities. You shouldn't take from that so-called dopamine pool so often. Let yourself add to it and see its effects on motivation and mindset. The real key, as Huberman says, is to not chase high levels of dopamine every time you do something. That lowering of baseline from heightening of dopamine usually will cause you to go back to that dopamine spiking activity, just like the casino or illicit substance examples from earlier. Further to this, if you're up for it, you can do deliberate dopamine lowering activities. An example of this would be cold exposure in the form of an ice bath or cold shower. These would raise dopamine baseline for a few hours and help you out if your baselines are getting low. There's been a lot of talk about dopamine fasting, where you don't use your phone and whatnot, and if your phone is the reason for your dopamine baseline being lowered, then that can be very effective. This type of stuff is all very case specific, however, and you'll need to look into this type of stuff yourself, see what works for you. Like for example, I actually have my phone set to black and white. Look, here, there you go. That's me. I did that since I would catch myself mindlessly scrolling through short form content, YouTube Shorts, TikTok, for like 10 plus minutes, and I didn't want to, but I still would. I would just mindlessly do it. So I did that and I stopped. That worked for me. So anything that works for you, you have to do on a case specific basis. Hold on my phone, I think we have a message.
My fellow Americans, make sure you join the Discord, link in the description and in the comments. Gamba is trying to build a sense of community since his channel is very small, and your help would be much appreciated.
I have to cut the summary short because this episode is just so information dense. The link for the rest of it is in the description if you want to go check it out. Go check out everything else in the description. Bye-bye.